Yeah, go ahead, Titiksha. Close to reality. What is close to reality?
Close to reality, like things which aren't. I'm. It is my understanding that close to reality, as in what is probable, what can happen in the real world, which is
But
not.
what is closer to reality? As a question.
Which is not which is not too fictitious or fantasy based, not supernatural. It is.
You are right, but I'm asking you, what is closer to reality?
What is closer to real? In what sense, sir?
That's what I'm asking. You said closer to reality, but I'm
Oh,
asking you.
like the literature, the
Ah,
fiction, the prose writing.
right. So art
Yeah.
should be closer to reality is one of the underlying assumptions of realism, right? And it involves, as you say, avoiding what?
Supernatural, fantastical elements, too
Right.
fictitious.
Yes. And closer to probability, which reminds you of something. Does it remind you of something? प्रोबेबिलिटी का आइडिया हमने कब डिस्कस किया था पहले?
Aristotle.
Aristotle, right? Okay. But for Aristotle, probability would include even gods behaving in certain way, right? So, uh, realism of 19th century, though it seems to be oriented towards Aristotelian ideas of probability and necessity, there is a distinctive understanding of what is reality. For Aristotle's, gods and titans would be reality. Hmm. Right? Uh, Oracle जो कहता है वो reality होती है for Aristotle. So what is meant by reality has undergone a change. That is something that we need to understand, because reality itself is not so much a fixed idea, is it? Is idea of reality a fixed idea? And what do you mean by reality? Yeah. So what is reality? अब मुझे ये मत कहना रियलिटी रियलिटी होती है, ये सब है वो रियलिटी.
Well, reality includes things that happen, events that take place.
Okay.
And I think that is not the same for all, or it does not have a fixed definition according to me, because our interpretation of the events or the things that happen hugely vary, and that we see even in terms of history, how it is prone to changes, even though it is something which has already happened, and that sort of distorts our views of reality too, and it doesn't become one uniform aspect for all.
Exactly. And reality, as we are aware as uh, uh, students of Western literature, I will just hold on one moment, please. Yeah. If you go back to our good old Plato, Then he said that reality and existence are not the same thing. This pen exists, but it's not real, right? So what is reality in the West has been a contested domain, right? Remember Plato's allegory of the cave? किसी को याद आ रहा है? Allegory of the cave, right? So what is reality is a difficult concept, right? So according to some theorists, realism is avoiding the question what is reality, avoidance of the question what is reality. Uh, uh, but if you, as we have been discussing, we are not so much, or we are not primarily interested in ideas of criticism as much as we are interested in their historical context, right? What gave rise to such ideas is our focus in this course. And realism is a kind of ism, right? Is also something that needs to be kept in mind. So what do you understand by the suffix ism? This is also a topic that we have been ongoingly discussing from past semester. Does anyone remember the suffix ism?
So that there are certain principles and ideas that are upholded when we like use this suffix of ism. So when it comes to realism, there are certain basic ideas about realism that will be upholded by people, and yeah, as Saloni pointed out, a
Which
school
people?
of
Everyone?
no,
All
not
you?
like
What?
this. The people who will, who follow those tendencies and which are reflected in their work. So in that way, we can kind of analyze who follows
Yeah,
realism and who
ism as
doesn't.
a word, right? In Hindi, in Marathi, Gujarati, you use the suffix wad. Yani you are upholding some argument, right? So it's also important for a movement. So isms very often imply movements like romanticism, right? Or neoclassicism, right? Or modernism or surrealism. So ism as a suffix means that there are certain people who uphold, propagate some ideas and principles, right? And it might also be a school of thought, as Saloni says. So ism as a suffix. So realism implies a certain kind of movement by a group of people who upheld the principle of realism. And what is the principle of realism? Can anyone tell me? What can be the possible uh, principle of realism? Should I repeat the question? What is the principle of realism that these realists would uphold? To offer a right representation of the world. Can you say something more, Saloni?
So, I think that the principle of realism particularly focuses on this, that it should offer a very
It should means what should?
realism should.
But it should yani kya? What should offer a right representation of the world? Art should.
Art should, okay.
And that's what I asked even Titiksha. It
Yeah.
should close to reality. But kya close to reality? Art, right? And as you rightly pointed out, it is representation, right? It is itself not reality. A realistic painting of mango is not mango, right? Hana,
Yes, sir.
right? So there is a distinction that you should bear in mind, that fiction should be a true representation of reality or the world, right? And now fiction in itself is not reality, but representation. So there is realistic film. There can be realistic painting. That can be realistic poem. There can be realistic novel. Showing the world as it is, right? Again, Asma, what shows the world as it is? Art should show the world as it is. Very good. So that is the principle that these people upheld, the realists, right? And we will take a closer look, and I think there is a definition given of realism on page 469. Not 469. Hold on. On 470. कहाँ गया? अरे नहीं 471. I'm sorry. There's definition given on page 471 of realism. Key term art, क्योंकि realism of something. There is a realist movement even in philosophy, right? And it defines itself in contrast to idealism by saying that the reality exists independently of our mind, right? Page 471 gives you this definition. The most general aim of realism was to offer a truthful, accurate, and objective representation of the real world, both the external world and the human self. To achieve this aim, realists resorted to a number of strategies: the use of descriptive and evocative detail, avoidance of what was fantastical, imaginary, and mythical, as Titiksha pointed out, adhering to the requirement of probability, as she again pointed out, and excluding events which were impossible or improbable, inclusion of characters and incidents from all social strata, dealing not merely with rulers and nobility, focusing on the present and choosing topics from contemporary life rather than longing for some idealized past, emphasizing the social rather than individual, or seeing the individual as a social being, refraining from use of elevated language. Yes, fantastical in the sense of fantasy, right, Saloni? Yeah. Unlike how we use it these days. We'll come to that. Refraining from the use of elevated language in favor of more colloquial idiom and everyday speech, as well as directness and simplicity of expression. So is reality nominal? Smith, मैं तेरे को कांट का फोन नंबर दे देता हूँ, तू उसे पूछ लिए, right? Smith को फोन नंबर देना पड़ेगा कांट का. Okay, so this is what we mean by realism. Actually, this is the term used by Kant, and we really don't know if it applies. But interesting that you brought it up, Smith, because realism seems to be about representing the phenomenal world. Nominal, by definition, cannot be represented. Smith, is that clear? Realism insists on representing the phenomenal world rather than the nominal world. क्योंकि nominal world तो ऐसे भी पता नहीं हो. Good. Okay. So let us look at how this idea became prominent. Then if you look at the historical background to this idea, then one, just like Romanticism is a reaction against the established conventionality of neoclassicism, right? Wordsworth and Company Limited are rejecting neoclassical principles of art because they have become too prominent, dominant, and hegemonic in the society. And it is high time that people questioned and rejected that principle. So in some sense, realism is a reaction against or rejection of, partial rejection of romanticism, right? This is one of the important historical contexts that you have to keep in mind. The avoidance of fantastical, avoidance of supernatural, avoidance of nostalgia, avoidance
So,
of escapism. Yes, Saloni, bolo.
so why partial?
I will tell you that
Okay,
because there are some elements which are retained there.
okay,
And
okay.
even in Romanticism, if you see, there was a partial rejection of neoclassicism. Aristotle के बारे में वर्ड्सवर्थ भी अच्छा बोल रहा है और कॉलरिज भी अच्छा बोल रहा है. I hope you notice that, right? Because
Yes,
Aristotle says that poetry is higher form than history and it deals with universals. So Wordsworth and Coleridge both felt good about it. You're right. So it is not complete wholesale rejection of classicism. In same way,
right.
even romanticism, even realism retains some of the aspects of romanticism. And which one are those? We'll talk about it, right? But good that you raised this question. But you can see that this is a reaction against excessive romanticism, right? Romanticism, which began as a rebellion against neoclassicism, itself became new conservatism, new establishment. So in the West, there is a tendency to react against establishment. So realism, one of the important aspect of realism is this rejection or rebellion against romantic insistence on subjectivity, on supernatural, जैसे Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, insistence on fantastical or ancient past like Kubla Khan or Eve of Saint Agnes, right? I don't know if you've heard of that poem, Eve of Saint Agnes by Keats, right? So there are these kind of medievalism. So there is a tendency to turn towards contemporary social cultural realities as against this form of, I think, to an extent, escapist tendencies of romanticism, right? So that is one important historical context to be borne in mind. The other historical context is the rise of something called positivism, right? And positivism is a kind of tendency in social sciences like sociology, like uh, psychology, like economics, like other social sciences, political science, and so on, to use the model of natural science, right? Natural science is the science that studies nature, like physics, chemistry, biology, medical science, and so on and so forth, right? Social sciences are sciences which study societies, cultures, human behaviors, values. Now, such kind of disciplines which emerged during this time started adopting the model of social science and natural science. They would accept the ideas of physics and chemistry. The methodology of study of society should be similar to the methodology that you adopt to study matter, like physics or chemistry. And such kind of tendency is called positivism, right? And you can see it rises with the place of science in society gaining more ground, gradually displacing religion in European context, right? Religion is being slowly eroded by scientific spirit, and we discussed Darwin in the morning, right, as one of the important thinker of the period, influential thinker of the period. origin of the species is what we discussed. Now this
So,
positivism, yeah.
so
Yeah.
then there is this science element in positivism. Then isn't it there in realism?
Exactly. But realism again, कहाँ पे है? What should be realistic? Realism कहाँ पे है? क्या realistic होना चाहिए? This is for the third time I am asking the same question. Art,
Oh,
right? क्या हो रहा है आपको? नींद आ रही है, कॉफी कम पड़ गई, क्या है पता नहीं. Right. So we are discussing natural sciences. So positivism is a belief in natural science that, I'm sorry, social science, that the methodology and approach of natural science is to be adopted, which means you should study societies in the same way as you study chemistry or biology or physics. I hope you have got what I mean by positivism, right? And some of the most important thinkers, in fact, founders of sociology, are people like Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim in France. So Emile Durkheim and Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer in England, these are the three thinkers who use the method and approach of natural science in their understanding of human sciences. Is that much clear? What is positivism?
yes, sir.
And according to some people, this positivist tendency is a reaction against Hegelianism. And Habib talks about a Marxist philosopher named Marcuse or Marcuse, according to some, I don't know how to pronounce it, Herbert Marcuse, who says that positivism or positivist philosophy is politically conservative as against Hegelian negative philosophy. And what do you mean by Hegelian negative philosophy? Is that in Hegel, negation is the mechanism of progress, right? Society as a given should be negated in order to have progress. By negated, you mean critiqued, overturned, questioned, rejected, right? So there is a in Hegel, there is a tendency to question, reject, overturn the given society and culture in order to have a more advanced and progressive society, right? This is the Hegelianism. Positivism says that the society and the world before us, right, are not to be rejected, but to be accepted on its own terms, right? So sociology is not primarily about negating society, but in some attempt to affirm society as it is. I hope I'm clear in what I have said. So it, according to Marcuse, positivism or positivist philosophy is conservative. It does not oppose the given social reality, right, as against Hegelianism. So there is a tendency to reject Hegelian romanticism in positivist thought, and efforts are made to avoid metaphysical questions. यानी आत्मा क्या है, परमात्मा क्या है, ब्रह्म क्या है, जगत क्या है, मिथ्या क्या है. Instead of that, you should deal with more empirical data. Not earlier society, the existing society. दिग्विजय,
Okay.
जो समाज आपके सामने है उसको निगेशन करना चाहिए, ऐसा हेगल कहता है, so that it moves ahead, progresses, right?
Okay,
So negative philosophy characterizes Hegelian dialectic,
All right.
right?
Get.
And as opposed to it, positivism says that you have to accept and understand the society as it is, right? In short, Hegelian approach is critical as against positivist, which is more of trying to get empirical data and understand the laws of society, right? So just like there are laws of gravity, there are laws of society according to positivist sociology. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
So, sir, is positivist philosophy is not using the historicism that Hegel provides, like understanding things in their context, understanding society in
No,
ancient
it
history.
does, but it does not attempt to negate it, criticize it.
Okay.
That's what some people say, right? Like Marcos, who belongs to Frankfurt School of Marxism. Uh, right. So according to Frankfurt School, which Habib is talking about here. So in a way, it is a kind of, according to Habib, positivism is a conservative reactions against Hegelian negative philosophy. It is also a rejection of metaphysical tendencies of romanticism that you find in Hegel. The idea of the absolute and the spirit and Geist, right?
Yes.
Instead of that, you study the society in front of you.
But sir, like it's still not getting clear. The thing is, Hegelian negativity is presented as something, like the notion of overturning and rejection is understood. But Hegel is also pointing out that progress will happen in only in that sense, like critique and overturning, and that you only have a certain amount of knowledge at one point of time, and then
Yeah.
it progresses.
Yeah.
So
Right.
what is wrong with that? Like positive philosophy is talking about understanding society in its own terms, but uh, it needs to understand things in the Hegelian way, right? In order to understand society that is in front of you.
But they are rejecting the whole apparatus of Hegelian dialectic. They don't see society as being progressing from using dialectical mechanism,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And this is what they don't accept of Hegel. And Hegel's metaphysical beliefs is something that they reject against more empirical and commonsensical and what is in front of you, pragmatic kind of reaction. Yes, Saloni, go ahead with your question.
Yes, sir. So then, regarding what Digvijay asked, I still have some confusion. So does this line help on page number 472, second paragraph in the middle? Hegelian idealism and historicism increasingly gave way before positivism, reflected in various brands of realism and naturalism. What does it mean?
Which page number? 4?
So 472,
Hmm.
second paragraph in the middle.
In the middle, yeah.
Something. Hegelian idealism and historicism.
Right. So it is a reaction against Hegel.
Yeah,
Right?
but historicism is also mentioned here.
Historicism of Hegel, Hegelian variety. Look
Okay.
at that sentence, right? He reflected even in the literary historicism of figures of Georg Gottfried Gervinus, influenced by Hegelian aesthetics. Hegel's idealism and historicism increasingly gave way before positivism, reflected in various brands of realism and naturalism. It's the same thing.
Okay.
Yes, Titik, you are right. And in fact, Marx would very famously say, Marx is a kind of, he builds his theory on Hegel, right? Marx says that philosophers have only understood the world or interpreted the world. The point is to change it, right? These are famous statements by Marx. And we'll discuss that when we are discussing Marxism. So positivism seems to be focusing on how reality or social reality is to be understood rather than to change by negating it. Right? समझने पर ज़्यादा भार है. You are right. Right? Yeah. So these are some of the broad intellectual developments. And remember, this happens more in the domain of prose and fiction. In poetry, you have certain mutated versions of romanticism. Yes. No, positivism is seen as conservative, Asma, because they excluded Hegel's idea of negation, not metaphysical ideas. Asma, positivism, yeah. Because they accept society as it is rather than to negate it. Right? And Hegelian dialectic is based on not just negation, but negation of negation. Yani, capitalism is negation of feudalism, but communism is negation of capitalism. Now, capitalism is already negation of feudalism. So it is twice negation, negation of negation, right? Dialectic. So it is a non-dialectic understanding of contemporary history. It focuses more on empirical data. Right? So sociology was largely positivist. And when this positivism entered into theory of art in poetics, poetics यानी कैसे कहानी को लिखना है, उसकी theory, तो उससे naturalism कहते हैं. Right? We'll discuss that when we look at naturalism, but I'm just giving you a sense of it right now. So these are some of the historical developments that you should keep in mind, which led to rise of realism and naturalism. But there is one more very important development which is mentioned but not emphasized. Yes, Smith. Knowing history, but you can see the emphasis is more on existing history. What is in front of you, Smith, rather than negating the existing society. I hope you get what I'm saying. History as it actually happened. So they would, very good question, Smith. So positivist historiography would be that which is based on evidence, empirical evidence, rather than on dialectic. I hope you get it. Yes, like being objective about it. While romanticism seems to emphasize subjectivity, realism seems to emphasize objectivity. And that applies even to history, the question Smith has asked. Right? History also has to be evidence-based rather than armchair based. हेगल कुर्सी में बैठ के कहता है कि ये है नियम इतिहास का, पर उसका कोई तुम्हारे पास प्रूफ है? What is the proof of your theory of history? Right? So there is a turn towards empiricism and scientific study of history. Right? So positivism, as it is used in historiography, emphasizes yes, but they do not criticize in the way Hegelian criticizes. जैसे कि feudalism है, right? And इसमें से capitalism आया, तो positivist historiographer would be interested in collecting data of it, rather than saying that capitalism is a negation of feudalism. Exactly, but criticize is not very strong in positivism. Right? Criticism is not highlighted. They are not really interested in criticism. They are interested in evidence-based claims about past. So we want evidence in form of coins, in form of documents, in form of archaeological evidence, in form of whatever writings that you find, and so on and so forth. That is the current, and that became fairly deeply established in history as well. History as a subject became predominantly positivist in this period. Clear? So one more development that I have to talk about, it's mentioned, but they don't, it's not so much emphasized here, is the rise of photography, right, in the early part of 19th century. With photography, you can capture the world in a way that it creates an impression that it is real, right? So I think it's here on page number, where is it? Hold on.
So 474.
474 कहाँ पे है? हाँ, yeah. Last few lines, right? Lillian First, one of important scholars on realism, has pointed out that evolution of realism was affected by the Daguerre-Niepce method of photography presented in 1839, which facilitated a more exact reproduction of reality. So photography became a kind of model for art, right? That art should imitate photography. At the same time, there is a reaction later on against this photographic view of art. Titiksha is asking, positivism is aspect of realism or this period as a whole? Positivism is a development in social sciences, human sciences, and it has influenced art because it in some way represents the bourgeois ideology of the time, right? Which is more scientific, materialistic, positivistic, pragmaticist, utilitarian, right? These are the tendencies of that period, which says that. So, yeah. So positivism is an aspect of social sciences when they use approaches and methods of natural sciences, right? And that is also a tendency that is seen in art. Now, all these developments that I have mentioned, reaction against romanticism, reaction against Hegelianism, rise of positivism, rise of scientific spirit, a reaction against subjectivism and escapism in romanticism. जैसे कि कीट्स बैठ के जंगल में जो मोर नाच रहा है उसके बारे में लिख रहा है. Roughly, I'm not, he didn't really do that. I'm just telling you. You write on birds, ode to a nightingale and all that. Instead of that, those kind of tendencies, there is a tendency towards existing social realities in realism, right? So later you get a kind of information about realism in Germany, in France. In France, we are going to avoid Germany. हम जर्मनी जाना नहीं चाहते, बहुत हो गया. France, you have this development in the form of a journal called Realism, page 472, last paragraph. Reflects the life of ordinary middle class people. And it is all, the positivism is found in a very great scholar named Hippolyte Taine, Taine. and he is the person who has famously written a book called History of English Literature in French. Right. So what is interesting is that he is one of the first important literary historiographer of English literature, and he wrote a book called History of English Literature in French, which is a kind of landmark work. And what he does is that he develops a method of literary historiography, something which he called literature as an expression of man, moment, and milieu, M-I-L-L-E-A-U, milieu. That means literature is seen as an expression of human psychology. Moment means historical time or zeitgeist of that period. And milieu is the environment of the time. So he uses positivist methodology to write literary history of English literature. In England, we have important novelists like George Eliot, Anthony Trollope, Meredith Hardy, Gissing and Moore. In America, you have main theorists of realism in form of William Dean Hobbles and important realist writers like Henry James. On page 474, we have certain theoretical understanding of realism, and the rise of realism is explained by a certain Marxist critic like Frederick Jameson as one of the most complex and vital realizations of Western culture. And Lillian first describes realism as product of pervasive rationalist epistemology that turned its back on the fantasies of romanticism. According to Ian Watts, and Ian Watt is one of the most important theorists of novel as a genre. He says that modern realism begins from the position that truth can be discovered by the individual through his lenses. It has its origin in Descartes and Locke, that is the Enlightenment thought. And also going back to Aristotle. Another very important theorist named Eric Auerbach says, page all 474 pages, he distinguishes medieval realism from modern realism. And he says that in medieval realism, what is happening in front of you, right, is seen as a symbol of other world. The other world, this and that, here and there. So here is seen as a representation of there. But modern realism looks at the world in front of you. It is secular, this worldly, right? And secularism as a value in the West goes back to the Renaissance period, if you remember, with the rise of bourgeois ideology, right? And bourgeois ideology emphasized this worldliness, progress in this world, rather than the life after. Right? This was 5th semester. And before we started discussing 5th semester, I said that we are looking at the historical trajectory of modernity in the West. So realism is a very important expression of modernity because it is primarily secular and democratic in its outlook very often. That is something that you should keep in mind. And as Ian Watt says, it has got enlightenment connections as well. Kant says that real is that which is revealed by reason, right? The phenomenal world is revealed by reason. And Hegel says that what is real is rational, rational is real. So real and rational are the same for Hegel and Kant. So this is also something that seems to have appealed to realism. Yeah, Saloni, realism is one of the most important expression of modernity. It's a cultural expression of modernity, Western modernity. I'm sorry. Uh, on page 475, we see that and what says that realism is an epistemological problem, that is, how do you access reality, right? And Habib also emphasizes, third paragraph 475, that literary modernism is a reaction against realism, or tendency of realism to reduce experience to single dimension, ascertainable in terms of causality, chronology, and definable motive, right? And good example of what this means is the novels of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf. Are you aware of these novelists, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So, what are you aware of?
So they both, I mean, what is common about them both, or what I know about them, is that they employ stream of consciousness in their writing.
So, what
Virginia
is
Woolf and
stream of consciousness? Yeah.
writing, writing thoughts as they come in your head. I mean, I'm making it too simplistic, I think, but not like our thoughts are so haywire, and not refining them, not filtering them, sort of, and just placing them on the paper, using that mode to narrate something.
Right. Break away from traditional modes of writing. For example, a realist novelist, right? If you tell a realist writer to describe what is happening in your house, तो उसको अभी कुछ लिखने जैसा ना भी मिले. Because for a realist writer, reality is a very structured sequence of causality, right? It's an ordered kind of world, but that is not how our mind perceives reality. When you are walking down the street, you may see an advertisement which reminds you something of your childhood. So your mind goes into that kind of past. And from there, it may lead you to something in present, right? What you spoke to your friend. And from there, it may go to. So it moves through associations. Mind does not move in a logical, rational mode. So when James Joyce writes Ulysses, he is describing just one day in the life of Leopold Bloom, who goes out in the morning and comes back in the evening. कुछ होता नहीं है, मगर सब कुछ होता है. कहाँ होता है? लियोपोल्ड ब्लूम के अंदर होता है सब कुछ, right? The entire epic narrative is within. So epic is found not in outside events where heroes fight against monsters and devils, but when ordinary people are fighting against their internal monsters and devils. Right. So he dedicates 600 pages to describe one day where nothing happens. Right, and Virginia Woolf would say that life is not a series of gig lamps which are systematically arranged, but a diffused halo of light. And her job as a novelist was to capture that diffused halo rather than sequence of gig lamps. So realistic writing is like presenting reality as if it's logical and rational, right? almost Hegelian and Kantian in its outlook. While modernist writing rejected this traditional realistic mode of writing. And later on, structuralists like Todorov and Roland Barthes would use the word like reality effect, right? So he's saying that there is no such thing like reality and there can be no such thing like realism. But there are certain devices and tropes which the writer uses to create an impression of reality, right? So he talks about those techniques and science and methods of writing which are create the effect of reality effect, right? So this is a background to realism, and we will start looking at the important realistic critics from tomorrow. And those are George Eliot, Émile Zola from France, William Dean Howells and Henry James from America. And George Eliot is familiar to you, right?
Yes, we studied it in history.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, sir, we studied this in history of English literature.
Yeah. George Eliot कौन किसका नाम है?
Mary and Evans.
Evans.
Mary and Evans का नाम जॉर्ज एलियट है, तो उसका नाम भी रियल नहीं है और बात करेगी वो रियलिज्म के ऊपर, राइट? तो रियलिज्म के ऊपर ध्यान बांटने आ रही है जॉर्ज एलियट जिसका नाम भी रियल नहीं है. Okay, that will happen tomorrow.
The
Right?
criticism class would have been so funnier if you lectured us in Hindi. And with such
नाम रियल
comments.
नहीं है उसका, तो वो रियलिज्म पे ज्ञान बांटेगी आपको कल से. Yeah. So, any questions about whatever we discussed today? Yeah. Positivism. No, positivism did not talk of rejecting Hegel. Hegel talks about rejecting reality, or negating is the word, not rejecting so much. Negating reality, right? So positivism negates Hegel. You can say that, but it does not reject reality, right? Hegel says the reality has to be negated in order to be transcended or sublated. While positivism talks about not negating reality, but understanding and analyzing it based on data. तो डेटा ये वर्ड आता है तो समझना ये पॉजिटिविज्म है.
यस सर, बट सर नहीं मान रहे ना हेगल की बात, तो वही बात हो.
नहीं, हेगल को वो हेगल को रिजेक्ट कर रहे हैं, रियलिटी को रिजेक्ट नहीं कर रहे. ये समझना है, हेगल रियलिटी को रिजेक्ट करने की बात कर रहे हैं. आई होप यू गेट दैट. So there is a difference here that you have to keep in mind. So they are negating Hegel, but not reality. But Hegel says negate reality. Right. Good. Any other questions? Okay. So see you tomorrow. Then you take care. Yeah. See you tomorrow and take care. Yeah.